Welcome to Disapplication's process presentation. My name's Karamir Muffet, and also taking part in this presentation is going to be Nick Mantle. So when setting schools' budgets, local authorities can apply not to adhere to a requirement of the Schools in Early Years Finance Regulations 2023 or to the Dedicated Schools Grant. We also know that as the DSG conditions of grant. It's important to note that regulations being disapplied for 24-25 will be the 2024 regulations, but unfortunately they're not getting laid until January 24. So for all intents and purposes, you do still use the 2023 regulations, and once we receive this application request and the updated regulations, we'll make sure that it has the correct regulation attributed to it. So the regulations and the DSG conditions of grant detail how the local authorities are able to distribute the DSG funding, such as the allowable funding formulas factor, and also the pass-through rates and the ring fencing between blocks. The regulations also cover what local authorities can retain for central expenditure. So, for example, statutory responsibilities that local authorities hold for all schools or maintained schools only, such as admissions and audits. The department receives requests from local authorities to set aside some aspects of the regulations or conditions of grant where they have identified that there's an unintended consequence due to a local situation. The key message here, of course, is that any disapplication request should be for exceptional reasons only, and there must always be a regulation to disapply. So moving on now on how to apply for a disapplication. This year we're going to be seeing the introduction of digital disapplications. Because this has completely changed, we felt it better to hold a separate workshop purely to show you how to apply for a disapplication through the digital process. So moving on to safety valve local authorities, all the safety valve local authorities have already been contacted individually with details about how they should submit their disapplication requests for 24-25. So local authorities who are in round 4 of the programme will receive further details about this shortly. And if you are from a safety valve local authority and have any queries about submitting a disapplication request, please make sure you contact the safety valve team as soon as possible. So what supporting information do we look for then when we receive a request? This slide will cover block movements, high needs general and early years disapplication requests, and we'll look at the type of supporting information that you must be providing alongside your disapplication requests. We need to know the impact your request is going to have on your schools, your pupils, and your local authority itself, and any alternative options that have been considered. We need to know what alternatives have been explored and why these alternatives haven't been taken forward. We also need to see supporting financial modelling, such as local authorities' DSG position and up-to-date financial position of the affected schools, including their levels of reserves. We need to know if any transitional steps or mitigations have been considered and agreed, and if your request will then result in a reduction in funding. If it does, we need to see an explanation of what steps you have taken to ensure there would not be any detriment to pupils' outcomes and education provision. You need to detail what the wider context of this request is, so please detail how you've considered local factors prior to submitting this request. And you also need to detail how this request aligns with the local authority and DfE future strategic approach to education provision. So, for example, Ofsted improvement and DSG recovery plans. We need to see consultation outcomes, specifically what are the views of impacted schools, parents and carer groups, schools forum and other interested parties. And we also need to see a copy of the schools forum minutes detailing the votes for the disapplication request so that we can see when the meeting happened, what the forum voted on and what the outcome of that vote was. And finally, you need to include summaries of any other consultations. Moving on to the overview of the process then. When we receive your request to disapply the regulations, we initially review the supporting evidence and ensure that what we need is there with that disapplication request. At this point, we might come back to you to ask for some more additional information or to ask some questions that we might have, either on the supporting information submitted or on the request itself. This is then put up to the Secretary of State to make a decision. Once we've got the response back from the Secretary of State, We then communicate the decision to the local authority, including any conditions which might be attached to the decision. So the considerations then that we make will always consider why this request is the local authority's preferred option, why the local authority considers this to result in the best possible outcomes for the pupils, the schools and local authorities in the short and the long term. I'm going to move you on to block movements requests now. So all block movement disapplications are considered on a case-by-case basis, and each request will apply for 1 year only. The schools block will again, like previous years, be partly ring-fenced in 2024-25. This means that you can transfer up to 0.5% of your schools block funding into another block with the approval of your schools forum. In all other cases of wanting to move funds, you must submit a block movement disapplication. So this includes if you want to move less than 0.5%, but you don't have the support from your schools forum, or if you want to move more than 0.5%, even if you do have the schools forum approval. This year it's important for all local authorities that are wishing to make a block transfer to get in touch with us to have a discussion, even if this transfer is below 0.5% and you believe that your schools forum are on board with that transfer. So the first thing then that we look for in this in the supporting information sent to us alongside the disapplication request. So most requests currently are to move money out of the schools block and over into the high needs block. The guidance on the .gov.uk website details all the information we need to see alongside that request. And we have already discussed this in an earlier slide, so I won't expand on this again. However, for block movements, there are also some additional specific requirements that we have. So we have a management plan template that I'm sure you'll all have seen. You can use that template, and if it's fully completed, it could be used to show the majority of the financial information that we'll need for a block movement request. If you use the form or not, though, we also need to see, in addition to the management plan, information around any previous block movements, including those that didn't require a disapplication request, details around the pressures the movements of previous blocks of money were designed to address, a full breakdown of specific budget pressures justifying the transfer of money, and that includes changes in demand for special provision over the last 3 years and how the local authority has met that demand by commissioning places in all sectors. All this information should be quantified where possible. We also need an assessment of why the high needs costs are exceeding funding levels and plans to change the pattern of provision where it's necessary to do so. We need an assessment of the need to seek schools forum approval for further transfers in future and consideration of plans to avoid this if possible. And we also need detailed explanations for the requirement of the transfer for the high needs block. We need details around the partnership between the local authority, those institutions offering special and alternative provisions, and that includes mainstream schools and parents, and between the local authority and neighbouring authorities. We need to know what, if any, contributions are coming from the health and social care budgets towards the cost of more complex specialist places, and also what has been considered when it comes to how additional needs funding would be targeted to good and outstanding mainstream schools that provide an excellent education for a larger than average number of pupils with high needs, or excuse me, or to support the inclusion of children with SEND in mainstream schools. We also need to know the details of the effect that any transfer is going to have on individual schools' budgets funded from the schools block. And also we need to see the information you've presented to the schools forum and to all schools through consultation and details of the responses to the transfer proposal. So each request is then considered on a case-by-case basis, but the department has certain criteria that they look for in determining whether the local authority has a strong case for block movement. So these are what we look for. We look for strong evidence that a further transfer remains necessary to address significant cost pressures. We look for specific and detailed plans which demonstrates the transferred funding would contribute to addressing cost pressures in a sustainable way, such as investor save options. We look for strong evidence of a marked and recent transfer of financial responsibility for children with high needs from the schools block to the high needs block. So, for example, through a significant increase in permanent exclusions requiring the local authority to make more alternative provision, or maybe there's been a significant increase in the proportion of children with the HCPs which have been placed in specialist settings rather than mainstream schools. We also look for a strong SEND sufficiency plan outlining the actions that your local authority will take to ensure a sustainable SEND sector, along with how the transfer will impact this work. And we also look for a good level of support for the transfer of funds from local schools and the schools forum. And this includes seeing a breakdown of local consultations. So when we've received all this information, we use it to provide a summary and a recommendation to the Minister. When drafting that summary, we have to include information around why the high needs costs are exceeding funding levels. And we also have to provide a detail of short, medium and longer term strategies, including the financial data that the local authority has planned. And just to highlight how important it is to provide the necessary information for the disapplication request at the start of the process. Notoriously, we're often hanging back for evidence that Schools Forum has voted for or against the request to transfer money because Schools Forum meetings are often arranged after the closing date for block movement disapplications. So without this information, we're unable to put your disapplication request up to the Minister. And that then results in delays getting decisions back. That then has a knock-on effect for you, as you may well be asked to provide two APTs. One is if the disapplication request has been approved, and one is if it's not been approved. So it's twice the work that it creates. So that's the block movement requests. I'm now going to move you on to high needs disapplications. So for all high needs disapplications, it's really important you discuss these with us prior to the deadline and before a formal submission, as the calculations can be tricky and sometimes a disapplication isn't actually needed. So within the high needs disapplications, the types of disapplications we receive are for special schools MFG. So the MFG rules are detailed in Annex 1 of the High Needs Operational Guide. And for this, a disapplication of the relevant DSG condition of grant is required. But please also remember that if your authority is a safety valve LA, as we said earlier, these disapplication requests should be discussed with them and submitted to the safety valve team through the process which has been notified to you. Then there are the rules for allocating the additional 3.4% funding to special and alternative provision scores. This is the extra funding made available following the 2022 autumn statement. The rules in the conditions of grant and Annex 2 of the latest High Needs Operational Guide are quite specific and precise and are slightly different from the 23-24 rules, and the information required is different from other disapplication requests. So local authorities should look carefully to see if a disapplication of the relevant DSG condition of grant is actually required. And finally, there are the disapplications for funding further education for 19-year-olds and above in schools. For this, a disapplication of the relevant regulation is going to be required. And so expanding on special schools minimum funding guarantee, which as we know is also known as MFG. A special school MFG will continue to apply to maintained special schools and special academies, including special free schools in 24-25. The MFG must be set at a rate to ensure a school's total budget for place and top-up funding is at least 0% using the school's 23-24 funding baseline, and it must be within a range of 0% to 0.5%. This is equivalent to the MFG for mainstream schools. So the local authority can set a higher percentage increase, but if they wish to set a lower percentage increase, they must make a disapplication request and have this approved, and these must only be in the most exceptional of circumstances. Detailed guidance and modelling examples have been set out in Annex 1 of the High Needs Guidance. The MFG means that no special school will receive less per pupil in 24-25 on a like-for-like comparison with their pupil cohort in 23-24 unless a disapplication request has been approved. So the calculation should make a few assumptions and they are that the number and type of places remaining the same this coming year as it did this year, and that all pupils in the school are placed by the provider local authority. That is usually where the school is located. And finally, that all top-up funding rates received by the school are those set by the local authority. Some of the most common issues we encounter when receiving these disapplication requests is that there are gaps in basic background information, which makes it challenging to comprehensively understand the basis of the request. So sometimes clarity isn't always forthcoming about the status and timing of additional or transitional funding the LA is providing, and that might result in a disapplication not being required. Sometimes the LA's modelling for the MFG request isn't up to date and it isn't set out in the correct format. We'll always expect local authority to consider and respond appropriately to schools' cost pressures in securing the provision required for the pupils. They should take account of any costs the schools can't escape from, for example, energy prices or staff pay awards. And for the current funding year and for the next funding year, there's some funds that should be excluded from the MFG calculation, which are the teachers pay additional grant, high needs funding that the school receives in place of the teachers pay grant, and the TPCG and the pensions supplementary fund, and the additional funding for the current financial year and next financial year that local authorities are required to pass directly to maintain special schools and special academies. Where a local authority wishes to adjust the top-up funding across several schools, for example, following a review of its top-up funding rates, and as a result, some schools gain funding and others face a reduction, a disapplication will be required, although the request will only be relevant to those schools whose funding will fall below the guaranteed level. Consequently, local authorities should not through this process seek endorsement of the entirety of a new top-up funding system that they are intending to implement across some or all of the special schools. So when submitting a disapplication request, the core information that we need so a fair and reasonable decision can be made is information on previous requests to the Secretary of State, what the status of the decision, whatever the status of the decision, how the impact on specialist education being provided to pupils by the school that are not meeting the MFG has been considered, why this request is the local authority's preferred option, what alternatives have been considered and why they were discounted, including any options appraisal, any transitional arrangements that the local authority is putting in place to minimise the impact of the special schools and to provide assurance for their ongoing viability and relevant local contextual information. For example, the results of recent Ofsted inspections. We also need to see specific supporting information with the request, which are detailed in the High Needs Operational Guide under Annex 1, paragraph 16.1.
So these next couple of slides we're going to look at, we'll just cover off very briefly aspects around general disapplications. So on the slide you can see in front of you, we would say that the most common types of general disapplication requests are those that you can see listed. I won't read through the entire list now, but it just gives you a sense of which requests do most frequently come into the department where general disapplications are concerned. Now, in terms of 23-24, exceptional circumstances were the most common disapplication requests that we did receive. Now, work has been undertaken ahead of 24-25 in respect of local authorities using exceptional circumstances factor. We've engaged with local authorities who use this factor to ensure that applications are in line with criteria or this application is due for renewal. Now, as we move towards national funding formula, we are of the expectation that we should see fewer disapplications of this type. And to support any disapplications that do come through, we are going to seek stronger evidence of any exceptional costs and why these may be unavoidable to local authorities. Just the final bullet point there at the bottom you can see is just drawing attention and signposting the consultation response on implementing direct national funding formula. We are going to provide further detail on how this factor will operate under NFF very, very shortly, but for now we are just taking the opportunity to signpost you to that consultation response again for anybody that hasn't taken a look at it yet and that wishes to see the detail involved in that. But moving on to early years, and some of this will be consistent with information that Karami has shared earlier on in the presentation with other disapplication requests, but a lot of it is applicable to early years as well. So in terms of breaking it down by the supporting information that we do look for within early years, it's helpful for us to see a consideration of all the alternatives that a local authority has considered, not just the actual disapplication request that they are making. So it's helpful to see why the disapplication was deemed as the most appropriate course of action that the local authority is seeking, and also to see why any alternative considerations were discounted, and what the impact of those alternative considerations may have been. In terms of calculation modelling, it's helpful for us to show exactly what the monetary impact is for relevant stakeholders and relevant parties impacted by the disapplication request. And that's whether it's a pass-through adjustment, a reduction in central spend, or a reduction in hourly funding for 2-year-olds. And it's also helpful for us to understand the wider implications of a request, and that means not just understanding the benefits of approving the disapplication, but also being aware of what the consequences would be if the disapplication request was declined. So as an example, if it was an adjustment to the early years pass-through that you were seeking, it would be helpful to understand what the impact of that would be if ESFA declined that particular request. Would it, for example, perhaps disincentivize an appetite to create 2-year-old places within the local authority? So it's sort of having that balanced perspective on looking at what are the advantages of approving the disapplication, but also what are the consequences if it was to be declined. The process for assessing a disapplication, again, you'll find is very consistent with the information that Karami has just shared. So it'll be myself that picks up any early years disapplication requests. I'll seek views of colleagues within the department, most notably our early years policy colleagues within DFE, and then I'll either revert back to yourselves in the local authority if there's some further information required, and a submission that will go up to the Secretary of State for a decision. And obviously, once we receive that decision, we'll ensure it's communicated back down to the appropriate local authority as quickly as we possibly can. In considerations that we do make, we do put an importance on an early decision from schools forum as being very, very helpful. And just a very general point that it's always helpful for us if we can have early sight of any disapplication that may be coming into the department. So we have an inbox where you'll submit your disapplication requests currently. It's always helpful to obviously have a notification through that, if possible, to say that a disapplication request is coming our way. Even if the pro forma itself isn't ready to be submitted at that point in time, just giving us the heads up that it's coming our way is useful, and it just means that we can plan our resource effectively so that we can turn it around for you as quickly as possible and get you the decision that you are needing. So in terms of early years, as you can see on the slide there, the most commonly requested disapplication equates to relates to the pass-through rate. But that said, other requests can include central spend additional factors disapplications, which will specifically link to Regulation 10. We also do receive requests sometimes for a reduction in 2-year-old hourly funding rates and early years provider amounts, which link to Regulations 11 and 12. What we do stress to you is when you are doing your calculation modelling, particularly in the case of adjusting the pass-through rates, when you're doing your calculation modelling to show the impact of adjusting that pass-through rate, it's important to factor in any funding that you're transferring into your early years block from elsewhere and making sure that's factored into your calculations. We do need to make sure that if we're looking at what the impact will be of an adjustment to a pass-through rate, that you are factoring in any additional funds that are being transferred into the early years block before you apply that reduction or that adjustment to your pass-through. It can be the case sometimes when those calculations are submitted to us that consideration isn't factored in. So it's that second to last bullet point there, just to make sure that that you are factoring that in before you actually put the figures through on the calculation within the pro forma itself. Moving on to equalities impact assessments, which I'll just refer to as EIAs for brevity for the remainder. So EIAs are provided to demonstrate that local authorities are complying with the public sector equality duty as set out in the Equality Act. The guiding principle is that sufficient information is provided which demonstrates that a local authority has given due regard to the need to eliminating discrimination, harassment and victimisation, advance equality of opportunity between persons who share relevant protected characteristics and persons who do not share it, and also foster good relations between persons who share a relevant protected characteristic and persons who do not. It should be applied to both new and continuing applications where, for the latter, the expectation is that an EIA would be updated to reflect the current data. Now, we are content with an overarching principle, which, for example, could be children and young people with similar levels of need receive similar levels of funding. But the EIA should also give consideration to all protected characteristics such as age, sex and race, irrespective of whether these are actually relevant to the request that you are making. Consideration should be given to how your proposals eliminate discrimination, harassment, or victimisation of any persons with protected characteristics. And we would also just say the proposal should also advance equality of opportunity between persons who share relevant protected characteristics and those who do not as well. On this next slide here, we've just got some key timelines to be aware of with respect to disapplications. Now, the key one I just want to draw attention to there is that second bullet point showing the 10th of October. And this again just references something that Karamia was saying at the start of the presentation with respect to the fact that we are planning to digitise the disapplications process. So at the moment, the 10th of October is our deadline for submitting requests to receive a response by December. Now, we will accept any disapplication request sent through to us by the 10th of October, irrespective of whether you've sent it on the existing Excel proforma template or on the new digital proforma. We are hopeful to have the digital proforma live very shortly, but if you've already taken steps and have began work to prepare your disapplication request for this year using the existing Excel proforma template, if that's submitted to us by the 10th of October, we will still assess it on the Excel template, even though we are, as I say, moving to a digital process going forward. 17th of November deadline that you can see there just obviously specifies the need for all requests to be submitted to us to receive a response by the APT deadline, and that includes all schools block movements which are above 0.5%, all those where schools form have not approved. And then finally there we've got the 12th of January 2024 deadline for any amendments to any block movement requests that have already been submitted to the department itself. And then last of all, just a few final thoughts on this. So the first thing we would always say is when you do submit this application to us, always try and put yourself in the position of the person reviewing it at the other side, and just look at it objectively from a point of view of saying, is there sufficient information within that request for us to be able to make a decision accordingly? Are there any gaps in your rationale or any areas that may still have question marks around them? And to try and look at it from that perspective as a way of making sure that the request is as comprehensive as possible, and that obviously then has a knock-on effect for meaning that queries back from the department to yourself should be fairly minimal. And then finally, the remaining slide we have is just some useful links for you there. So I would imagine most colleagues on the call are probably familiar with those links already, but it's obviously our disapplications guidance is linked there, as well as dedicated school grant conditions of grant, and obviously the early years and finance regulations as well. These two mailboxes at the bottom there are obviously of note for all local authorities. And again, drawing back to something I mentioned previously, which is if you are able just to give us any foresight of a disapplication coming our way, that LA disapplications inbox would be really helpful just to advise us of that. So again, we can prepare for our resource planning accordingly.